Thank you very much for joining me tonight. This is a long, rich and interesting story full of emotion, drama, courage and sacrifice by soldiers and civilians alike. This is a short talk and I've had to omit much material. I'm going to concentrate on three topics. The story of the events which led up to the execution of the soldiers and their civilian helper. This was the largest such execution of British soldiers caught behind the lines on the Western Front. Second point will be, why did the Germans commit this act, which was illegal under international law? Thirdly, was there a 12th man, a soldier, a British soldier, who escaped the clutches of the Germans at the last minute? If anyone wants further information, such as the soldiers' biographies, what happened afterwards, I'll take questions after the talk, or you could read the book. When we think of the British Army dead of the First World War, we think of those at rest in the great cemeteries scattered along the Western Front, or buried in communal cemeteries in France or in Great Britain. All of them killed by the bullet, the bomb, the bayonet, gassed or died of disease. For sure, that's how the vast majority died, but not all of them. Others were executed by the Germans after they had been caught on the run, many sheltered by French villages. I found 24 such soldiers, and this is the story of 11 of them. 5 Connaught Rangers, 5 Royal Munster Fusiliers, and 1 King's Hussar, and the French families who cared for them. Here they are on the Guise Civic Monument aux Morts in Guise, where they were executed on the 25th of February 1915. All 11 lost contact with their units during the retreat to the Marne, after the battles of Le Grand Fight, which is up here, and where on the 26th of August 1914, the German army cut in behind the Connaught Rangers and left some 300 stranded, lost without their units, who were left behind to try and fend for themselves or try and rejoin their units or attempt to escape back to Great Britain through Belgium and Holland. The next day in Etappe, the 2nd Royal Munster Fusiliers and a detachment of 15th King's Hussars were outflanked and encircled by the Germans there. Before surrendering, they had left 120 of their comrades in the surrounding fields and forests. This is the countryside in which they were left to fend for themselves, the Tirage, where the last vestiges of the Ardennes meet the plains of the Picardy. It's thickly wooded, many forests, many of them quite large, with orchards, tall hedges, and cut through by streams and rivers. The locals refer to their home as the Backage, and indeed it's much more like the countryside of Normandy than it is of the Western Front with which we're familiar. It bears little resemblance to the flatlands of Picardy or Flanders. It's an easy place in which to become lost and stay lost. This was to be home for the 11 soldiers for the next 6 weeks or so. So where did they end up? During August and early September, the soldiers lived in clogmakers' houses and woodcutters' huts. On mobilization, the clogmakers had returned to the villages, but the woodcutters and charcoal burners remained. They helped to feed the soldiers and they kept them informed of German movements. Gamekeepers helped too. Many of the woods were owned by the Duc d'Orléans, one of the many claimants to the French throne, who owned a chateau in Le Nouvillon, not far from Iran and Etappe. During September, the Germans started to pay attention to the Allied troops trapped behind their lines. They began to search the woods and forests for them, and they began to cut the forests down. The soldiers moved outside, moved indoors, and they moved into a small village called Derengte, which is not far from Iran. I've put Derengte up on the map here, and they lived there in the houses in the village, and they lived in the caves which are underneath, the cellars which are underneath these houses. The whole area sits on chalk, and it was easy to carve these out. The Germans still continued to intensify their searches for Allied escapees with threats of execution, house burnings, and deportation. The French were prepared to help, but in a deniable way. And they told the soldiers that they would like them to move out of the village, out of their houses, because if they were caught there, this would leave them, the French, exposed to the Germans. So what they did was they moved them into the fields between Derengte and Iran, and they built them a hut, which is marked on the map there. And to discourage German attention, they covered it in horse manure. Food was very scarce for them, and the soldiers scavenged the fields, troughs, and pig swill bins of Derengte and Iran. The land on which the hut was located belonged to a Monsieur Feuillet, and he rented some of his fields off to a Madame Loger, who ran a mill, which is on your map, called the Loger Mill, which was on the outskirts of Iran. It was one of her employees, a Vincent Chalandre, who found the soldiers in a starving, verminous, and ragged state. Vincent Chalandre and Madame Loger conferred, and they agreed that they had to help the soldiers. And after a little while, the soldiers moved into Iran. Now, at this time, there were not 11 soldiers, there were 9. 2 more came in later. 5 of them went into the Loger Mill, and 4 went into the attic of the Chalandre house in the center of the village. Now, who were these soldiers? Who were their helpers? We had Vincent Chalandre. He was a weaver in the textile mill in Iran. He'd lost his job early in August 1914 when France had mobilized and the mill had closed. He was a very simple patriot. Helping the Allies was one way he could take the war to the Germans. He had a wife who's on the far right-hand side, Olympe Chalandre, and they had between them 5 children. The eldest was Clovis, who was 16 in 1914. He too worked as a weaver in the factory opposite the family home. He too was unemployed, but he made a living smuggling produce to and from Belgium. In the Loger Mill, there were two formidable ladies. There was Leonie on the left and her daughter, Jeanne. Leonie was outspoken. Everyone who met her was very impressed by her. She was very forthright, and she didn't care who knew it. And indeed, in her trial, subsequent trial in Guise, her frankness nearly cost her a life. If Vincent was a patriot, then her motives were humanitarian. The soldiers, or mes pauvres enfants, as she called them, needed help, and that was sufficient reason. This is the mill in which 5 of the soldiers were lodged all along the top floor. The soldiers seem to have recovered physically very quickly. At this time in the occupation, food was not short. Madame Loger had a small holding with pigs, poultry, and cows, and she also ran the mill. Meat and dairy products were in abundance. The German armies took quotas, but they didn't pay too much attention to what happened on the farm. So what do the soldiers do all day? Well, I've been able to piece together a picture. They played cards. That was the standard recreation of bored British soldiers everywhere. Secondly, they went out. They made contact with another group of soldiers on the run. These were mainly 2nd Connaught Rangers, living in a hole in the ground near Fainey, about 4 miles north of Iran. They were led by a soldier called Private Francis Jameson of the 2nd Connaught Rangers one of the great unsung heroes of the First World War. They listened to the fantastic rumors about the progress of the war. These included Berlin had fallen to the Russians. There were 500,000 Russians in Berlin. The Kaiser had escaped, but the Empress was under arrest. 50,000 Canadians had landed in Ostend. The British were in Tournois, which was only 40 kilometers away. And the Spanish had entered the war on the Allied side. These rumors were always optimistic and at variance with the grim reality on the ground. They sustained a common idea amongst many soldiers behind the lines that the Allied arrival was only a question of time. Soldiers also flirted with the young ladies of the households, who seemed to have reciprocated. One of the soldiers told Jean Loges that his father was a rich hotel owner who lived in London. He actually lived in Nottingham and worked as a clerk. On the 5th and 6th of December, they were joined by 2 more fugitives, both 2nd Connaught Rangers, whom Clovis had met in the woods in one of his smuggling trips. Life proceeded this way until the 15th of December, when the Germans raided the mill. A mystery has always surrounded this raid. Were the Germans tipped off about the presence of the British soldiers in the mill? Yes, they were. Amongst the papers in TNA on this affair, I found a statement made by Jean Loges about this raid, and it sheds new light on why it took place, and it also changes our understanding of the whole story. So who informed? Why did the raid fail? And to answer these questions, we need to look at the history of the Loges family. In the center, we have Léonie Loges, who leased the mill in 1912. Her husband, Ulysse, was 20 years her senior. They had 3 children, Oscar, 16, Jeanne, 15, and Jean, 3. Between 1912 and 1914, the family are hit by 2 disasters. Oscar is crippled and mentally impaired by an horrific accident in the mill. These were very dangerous places in which to work. Ulysse has a stroke which mentally and physically impairs him. So Léonie is left with an infant son, and a teenage daughter to bring up, and a mill and a small holding to run. This is the background to a fateful decision to hire help in the form of Fernand Griselin, whom she offers to train as a miller. He is the son of a local worthy, Camille Griselin, a landowner, farmer, and councillor, a town council member of many years standing. Fernand and Léonie eventually become lovers and marry in 1919. Camille has what Jean called issues with Léonie. We're not sure what these were. Possibly he took objection to the relationship his son was having with Léonie, who was after all a married woman in a small Catholic community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Now, Camille had a friend, a Monsieur Feuillet, who we've already met, the landowner upon whose grounds the hut was placed. The soldiers had taken his vegetables, and he complained about this to anyone who would listen to him. Camille Griselin listened sympathetically and advised him to go to the commandanture in Guise to see the commandant, Richard Vactor, and to denounce the Loges family to him. Monsieur Feuillet obliges. The raid was well resourced, and some of it was well planned. A cordon was thrown around the village, and early in the morning, 40 military police arrived at the door of the Loges farmhouse. Panic struck the Loges woman. Jeanne was sent to the mill to waken the sleeping soldiers, while Léonie held the soldiers at bay at the front door. Jeanne went into the dormitory where the soldiers were sleeping, shouting, "Les Boches, les Boches." The soldiers immediately got up and made for the back door by the steps or chutes which connected the floors. Once there, they left the mill, waded across the River Iran, and hid in the copse on the other side. The Germans came into the mill with Jeanne at their head. As soon as she came into the room where the soldiers were sleeping, she froze in horror when she saw that the soldiers had left their pay books piled on a table in the center of the room. She didn't have any time to hide them. The Germans searched the room, but somehow missed the pay books. Neither did they notice that the mattresses were warm, which would have told them that someone had been using them in the past few minutes. The Germans leave, disappointed, empty-handed, but they know they've missed their quarry. As they are leaving, the officer commanding says, "We know they're here, and we will be back." While the search is progressing, Monsieur Griselin, their betrayer, prepares a warm meal for some of the military police. It seems that for Monsieur Griselin, revenge was a dish best served warm. The Loge women watched the convoy go, their hearts in their mouths, waiting to see if it stopped at the Chalandre house. But it passed it. Léonie Loge then collapsed in hysterics. When she had recovered, the soldiers were sent to a nearby quarry with a sympathetic owner, and they remained there for the rest of the day. An urgent meeting is convened with the Loge and Chalandre families, and it was decided that the Loge mill was now too dangerous and that all of the soldiers should move to the Chalandre house. That night they move in, passing through the village in stockinged feet, lest the noise of their boots should betray them. The raid failed because it was incompetently conducted. The Germans had plenty of time to research the mill, to observe it, but they didn't put a guard on the back door. If they had done that, they would have caught all the soldiers. They missed the soldiers' pay books, and they didn't check the mattresses. Wachter, the commandant in Guise, didn't hold the military police in high esteem. For the most part, they were reservists, elderly, wounded, or had been coned out of the operational frontline units on grounds of competence, and it seems that his low opinion was justified. So here we have a timeline of events in Guise and Iran after this date. The arrival of 11 soldiers in the Chalandre household immediately exposed the simmering tensions in the family. Possibly fortified by the wild rumors circulating on the war's progress, the soldiers want to stay. Victor Chalandre wants them to stay, but Olympe, his wife, wants them to go. She knows the danger their presence brings to the household of the soldiers, brings to the household of the soldiers and the family. She knows too that the Germans will not hesitate to shoot women for hiding Allied soldiers. All went uneasily until the morning of Thursday, 18 February. From this point on, events move quickly and eventually they spin out of control. On this day, the Chalandre household awoke to the sound of a German military convoy of 3 lorries pulling up outside their house. There must have been total panic, which subsided when they realized that they had not come to raid the Chalandre house, but they'd come to take the stock of raw material from the Pénicaud and Clairon textile mill, which stood opposite the Chalandre house. The ruins of this building can still be seen today. It's one of the few physical surviving remnants of the tragedy to be seen in the village. What would have worried the soldiers and the Chalandres is not the raid, but what it foretold. The Germans were nothing if not methodical, and when it came to looting French factories, there's a well-defined cycle of activities. First, they take away the stock, and that is what the soldiers and the Chalandres were witnessing on that morning. Then they would come back for the machinery, cut it out, and send it back to Germany. Finally, they would convert the building into something useful for them: a bathhouse, a laundry, an ammunition dump. But when that happened, the soldiers would have a permanent German military presence on their doorstep. It was time to go, and they began to lay plans for their departure. At the same time, affairs were coming to a head in Clovis's personal life. He was involved in a relationship with a young 22-year-old married woman, Blanche Griselin, who had a small baby, and her husband was away in the French army. She was in a three-way relationship with Clovis and a 67-year-old veteran of the Franco-Prussian War called Louis Bachelet. Bachelet suspected that Blanche and Clovis were lovers, and he decided to confront them. That Sunday evening, following the Thursday of the raid, he lay in wait outside Blanche's house. He'd been drinking heavily. He saw Clovis enter the house, and after a few minutes, he went in and he caught the young people in flagrante delicto. Words were exchanged and then blows, and Bachelet came out of the fight very much the worst. He left, but not before threatening to denounce the Chalandre family to the German commandanture in Guise. Blanche and Clovis don't believe him and say nothing of what happened to anyone. The next day, Monday, 22 February, he arrived at the commandanture in Guise, that's Bachelet, and sees that the commandant, Oberleutnant Richard Vactor, talked to him. Vactor needed very little persuasion about the truth of the British presence in Iran. He ordered a convoy of 40 military police to go to Iran in 3 lorries, and this time he decides to go personally to supervise the operation. While this is being organized, Leonie Loger arrives in the commandanture, and on the bottom right-hand side of the screen, you can see a picture of the interior of a commandanture. And she sees that Bachelet and Vactor are in conversation and realizes that something is amiss. She's gone there on a piece of routine business to renew one of her permits. There she stays for the rest of the day because Vactor orders her to be confined until further notice. The convoy arrives at the Chalandre house in mid-morning. Vincent Chalandre is in the courtyard. Bachelet, who still seems to think he's in control of events, descends to tell him that he's denounced him, his son, and the English deserters, as he calls them, to the Germans. His issues are only with the son and to a lesser extent Vincent. He doesn't want any action to be taken against the rest of the family, but he seems unaware that he's unleashed forces beyond his control. Some of the soldiers are caught downstairs in the kitchen where they are washing and repairing their kit. They are uniformed, and their rifles and over 1,000 rounds of ammunition are with them. In a statement made by a lamp made to the French police when she returned to France in 1917, she said that they were getting ready to leave, to try and escape through Belgium and Holland back to Britain. Some more soldiers were found upstairs, and they surrendered peacefully, one telling Germaine Chalandre that resistance would only make things worse for their protector. The soldiers are beaten, one slashed across the thigh with a sabre, tied up, forced to empty their house, pile up all of their furniture and possessions in the courtyard, and then to set fire. The next Germaine Chalandre was given a candle and told to set fire to the family home. This she does, and the family and soldiers are forced to watch as the Chalandre's possessions go up in smoke. When this is finished, the adults of the Chalandre family were taken to Guise along with the soldiers. The 3 youngest Chalandre children are left to fend for themselves in the streets of Iran. The mayor of Iran was taken hostage, probably with 2 or 3 other local worthies, and Iran received a standard fine of 30,000 francs. When the convoy arrived in Guise, the story of their arrest had already spread, and a huge, enthusiastic crowd was there to greet them. Pressing as close as they could to the lorry, in order to touch them. They were first taken to a military police prison where they were held for the rest of the day. Very late that evening, they were taken to the Kommandantur, where there was a repetition of the same enthusiastic reception which had greeted their arrival, so much so that the Germans had to employ force to keep them away from the British. Leonie Loges was still being held there. Wagner was convinced that she too was involved, but as yet he had no proof. So he arranged for the soldiers to pass in front of her, looking all the time for any signs of recognition between them, but he saw none. Once at the Kommandantur, the soldiers and the civilians were separated. The soldiers were beaten again, and the beatings continued throughout their interrogation. The next morning, Tuesday, the 23rd of February, the interrogations commenced. Soldiers and Chalandre family had agreed a cover story. The soldiers, according to the story, had only been in Iran for 1 week, and they had paid Vance and Chalandre for their accommodation. Initially, everyone stuck to this line. As part of their confession, they said that they'd been given food, crops from the field, but they paid for all the food that the Chalandres had given them. Many French civilians have reported that they had given food to the Allied soldiers on the run, but only at bayonet point. In most cases, this was a fiction designed to allow the French to help the British while denying any cooperation. Wagner didn't believe it. Bachelet had not denounced the Loges family because he had no issue. But there was the failed raid of 15 December when the Germans knew they had missed their prey. Then there were the cards found on the soldiers bearing the address of the Loges mill. Their excuse was that this was something the soldiers could show to a passing French person if they became lost on their wanderings. Everyone knew the Loges mill, but few had heard of the Chalandres. Corn dolls were found on some of the soldiers, good luck charms made by Jean Loges, but Wagner couldn't prove where they'd come from. And the story that the Chalandres had provided all of the food for the 11 soldiers for a week was frankly implausible. Wagner had seen the size of the pantry in the Chalandre house and knew it would have been impossible to feed them all with what was in the laundry. But again, he couldn't prove anything. The weak link in the chain proved to be Clovis. Wagner interviewed him for a second time and listened to his story in a bored manner. When Clovis finished, Wagner leaned forward and said, "Look, we know what happened. We have Monsieur Bachelet's statement. I have Monsieur Feuillet's statement. We found the soldiers in your house. We found 7 rifles and 1,000 rounds of ammunition. I don't need your confession to convict everyone. But the punishment is not yet fixed. You tell me what happened, or I will shoot you, your father, your mother, your sister, and the 2 Loges ladies." Clovis was only 16, and he told Wagner everything, implicating the Loges family in the process. Wagner immediately dispatched the convoy of military police to the Loges mill and farm, which they looted and burned. The Loges ladies were arrested and taken to Guise to join the Chalandre family in the cells at the Kommandantur. The soldiers were tried next morning. According to the German handbook on how to run a rear zone area, Wagner was in the chair. Somebody took the role of prosecutor, judge, advocate. Possibly, in view of the size and importance of the case, the principal legal officer in that German area, a man called Dr. Friedman, and a 3rd German officer. The charge appears to be brigandry, forming an armed band, more than 3 soldiers, and robbing the locals by taking crops from the fields and anything they could find in the farmyards and barns. The prosecutor would have presented the case against each of the 11 soldiers. Incidentally, he would have also been part of the tribunal, and each would have been allowed to reply. Given the brevity of the time, the trial was over in 3 hours, They wouldn't have been more than 10 minutes each. It's not clear if the soldiers were defended. The proceedings would have been in German, and the soldiers would have to relied on translations made by German officers. Such interpretations would have been partial, highly selective, and made with one eye on the time. It's not clear if any of them understood the charges against them or the proceedings. The soldiers, if they had understood the charges, could have correctly pleaded that there was no reference to brigandry as a capital offence in the Hague Conventions, reprinted in one of the British Army's soldiers' handbooks. And they would have been right. They could have correctly argued that they'd been caught in uniform, surrendered peacefully, and that under the Hague Conventions, they were entitled to prisoner of war status. Others could have argued that their family status, only son of a widowed mother, father of a newborn child, were all reasons why clemency should be extended. Or to no avail. They and Mr. Chalandre were sentenced to death to be shot next morning. Here you see the execution site in Guise Chateau. But once the sentence had been pronounced, there were still some important details to be settled. The first related to their burial. The communal cemetery was some way from the place of execution. Guise was a busy garrison town. The cortege would be long and slow and would disrupt the flow of military convoys to the front, which were a permanent feature of life in Guise. Further, Vactor had been unnerved by the display of solidarity shown by the French towards British soldiers. The burial of Allied airmen shot down over this area of the front had shown him that their funerals could be outbursts, occasions for outbursts of patriotic fervour, which the Germans had explicitly forbidden. These could be bad enough in small villages and the funerals of 1 or 2 airmen, but Guise was a large town and there would be 12 deceased. The risk of disruption was considerable. And afterwards, the graves had become the focus of celebrations to the opposition to German rule. The solution, therefore, was to bury them in the chateau. Further, there was the problem of the failure of the raid on 15 December. Vactor had been made to look a fool by a group of French peasants, most of them women and children, peasants as he would see them, and by a group of unofficered British soldiers. Vactor was a vicious brute, according to many French accounts we have of him. And these are important because the French could distinguish between good and bad Germans. He had a natural streak of cruelty, as is evidenced in some of the National Archive files on this affair. Migraine, a local diarist, likened him to Philaris, an ancient Greek tyrant who roasted his enemies in the stomach of a metal cow constructed especially for that purpose. Then there was his name, Vactor, which in German means watchman or sentinel. When news of the discovery of the British soldiers spread around the region, he was doubtless the butt of many jokes enjoyed by his fellow officers in the Etappe. Vactor, watchman, not on this occasion. Then there was the problem then there was the problem of the retribution for the failed German mill, on the failed raid on the Loger mill. Vactor decided that the 12 should be required to dig their own graves before execution. The soldiers were taken from the commandanture at 4 o'clock in the morning of 25th of February and taken to a small courtyard at the rear of the chateau. The scene was witnessed by Monsieur Larive from Iran, who was there, I think, to make sure that the message was taken home to Iran, that this is what happens to villagers who shelter Allied soldiers. There the soldiers were handed picks, spades, and shovels and told to dig. It appears that 2 communal graves were dug, 6 men to each one. When they had finished, they were lined up at the side of each of the pits. One British soldier stepped forward to offer a final memory of home, to remind the soldiers that they were British. He said, "Pray, hope, and think of England, whose sons were never slaves. All the soldiers then saluted. A ragged volley of shots rang out, and their bodies tumbled unceremoniously into their graves. One continued to show life and had to be given the coup de grace. In the afternoon, the civilians were tried and found guilty. Oscar was excused on the grounds of diminished mental responsibility. The others were given sentences of between 2 and 5 years, the longest being reserved for Léonie Loger. Vactor stated that he would like to have shot her, but he didn't shoot women. The sentences passed on the civilians in this case were remarkably light. The normal tariff for such offences, which are found elsewhere, was between 8 to 10 years. This was the standard punishment for towns who were, there was also a fine of 30,000 francs, which I've mentioned, which was the standard fine for towns who had harboured Allied soldiers. Earlier, Monsieur Bachelet had collected his 120 francs reward and returned to Iran, where he was promptly beaten up by a Monsieur Vigel, who in turn was arrested by the Germans and fined. So why did the Germans execute the British soldiers? And to answer this question, we need to look at the rules for the conduct of war. These executions appear to be in contravention of the Hague Convention of 1907, which the Germans were a signatory. At least the Kaiser signed it. At the time of the execution, unusually the Germans didn't give a reason. Normally, British soldiers were shot for refusing to give themselves up or spying. After the war, the German government was pursued for an explanation of why it had killed the British soldiers in this case. And they did give a reason, and that reason was reciprocation. It's one of 3 rules of war, 3 rules which they admitted for the conduct of war. The first 2 were the customs of war and military necessity. These were highly contextual, and despite many efforts made throughout the latter half of the 19th century, it was absolutely impossible to codify them. But reciprocation could be more concrete. Here, the Germans had found an order issued by the French army on the Alsace-Lorraine front, which said that armed German soldiers found behind their lines would be treated as brigands if they numbered more than 3 in number. So this is, you do it to us and we shall do it to you. We have found an order saying that you intend to do it to our soldiers, we are doing it to you. But were there other reasons? This was not the complete explanation of the German strategy. When I was doing the research for the book, I found very little information on German attitudes, so I decided on another approach. To gather what information I could about the British soldiers they had executed and see what story it told. This was an optic into the German strategy. Strategy is about what people do. It's not about what they write. It's not about what they sign. It's not about what they say. What did they do? So I collected information on the 24 soldiers, put them up on an Excel file and played around with it. I was looking for patterns, recurring themes, what was there, what was not there. The results were startling. I'll take you through the main findings. But insofar as I had a eureka moment doing this research, it came when I transferred the results onto a map, and that's what I found. This is Etappe number 2. Etappe was a German rear administrative area which was there to serve the needs of the army at the front line, to take resources, to manage hospitals, to manage supply chains, and of course to pacify the area. So it's a rear area administrative zone. There were 6 on the Western Front, and there was 1 over in Alsace-Lorraine. You may notice here that Bavay and Maubeuge are outside of this etappe, and that's because the French did not consider, the Germans did not consider them to be part of France. These were in the Belgian a German administrative area. And in the Belgian German administrative area, they had a policy that they didn't shoot any Allied soldiers who were taken on the run. On the other hand, all 24 of the executions of the British soldiers that I found were in this single area. And we've got the 4 soldiers at Le Catelet, who you might have read about in Ben McKinley's book, the 11 soldiers in Iran. There's another one in Etappe, and there's a collection of about 4 up beside Le Chateau, East Lancashires, who were left behind after Le Chateau. So what's happening in Etappe number 2? This puts the focus on that. So the first thing is the shootings were concentrated geographically. I couldn't find anywhere else in France or in Belgium. The second one is that they were not only concentrated in terms of time, in terms of area, they were concentrated in terms of time. The shootings start with the executions of 4 East Lancashire soldiers, as I've mentioned, in January 1915, shortly after a change in management in Etappe number 2. Robert Digby, the central figure in Ben Macintyre's book, A Foreign Field, who had a daughter and a young woman, a daughter with a young woman in a house where he's staying, is probably the best known. They're pictured here. But he was also the last. 19 of the 24 are shot between January 1915 and May 1915. Now, it's not that soldiers are not being found. They are. Many more are flushed out of hiding when the Germans retreat to the Hindenburg Line in the spring of 1917, but they're not shot. And whatever it is that is staying the German hand against British soldiers, it doesn't apply to Allied soldiers, French and Belgians, who are being shot up until the end of the war. So why is it that shooting British soldiers is not seen to have any value after May 1915? And why is it that the British are being exempt from this sentence? That brings us to the next slide. This unpronounceable word Auftragstaktik, the doctrine of Auftragstaktik. So we've got a pattern of executions of British soldiers that's marked by a concentration of violence in one area, Etappe number 2, and that for a short period of time. These are the classic symptoms of Auftragstaktik or mission tactics. It's a philosophy which permeated the German military thinking. In brief, it means the only criterion by which military tactics were to be judged was success. Did they work? Ends mattered, not means. This was a lesson drawn from the successes of the Prussian army enjoyed in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871, where victory in the field was attributed to the discretion given to local commanders to deploy tactics as the fighting unfolded. The doctrine passed into officer training, selection, and rules. As we have seen, it led to wide variations. Executions in one Etappe, but nothing elsewhere. In a French village straddled by an Etappe boundary, keeping pigeons could be a shooting offence on one side of the village. On the other, it could be the subject of a small fine. And all of this could change with a change in commandant. As one French diarist noted, the French don't know on which foot to dance. They didn't know whether they were coming or going. Auftragstaktik also stressed speed over accuracy, and mistakes were to be condoned. It was at the root of much German excess and illegal behaviour, burnings, summary executions, lootings, and the execution of Allied soldiers caught behind the lines. Factor and the German officers who were supposed to be supervising him could get away with this because they could. As Factor's commander, Stefan von Niebuhr, once remarked, "I can do anything I want, as long as it's not forbidden." Two other aspects which came out of the list. There were no British officers shot. There were 2 corporals in the list, no one of a more higher rank. This raised the question of whether an officer would have made a difference to the fate of the soldiers in Iran. I'm convinced it would. The soldiers always displayed what one French First World War historian called a certain leniency to officers. And what is most instructive in this respect is a court-martial which took place in the village of Sabancourt. This is a village in Etappe number 2. It's about 10 miles west of Iran. Here, there was a retired French cavalry officer, and he was found to be sheltering 4 French soldiers on the run. At his trial, he didn't attempt to deny his guilt. He argued that these soldiers had presented themselves at the farm and asked for his help. As a French army officer, he was honor bound to help them. He had no other choice but to take them in. It's not clear if he added, you, as fellow officers, would have done the same thing, wouldn't you? But then perhaps he didn't need to. His sentence was a 1,500 franc fine and 1 year in jail. His house and his farm were spared the torch. In passing sentence, the tribunal said that there were extenuating circumstances. To gauge the severity of his fine, his sentence, one should note that the penalty community sheltering soldiers was 30,000 francs. The fine for riding a bicycle without a permit was 500 francs. What the French officer did here was to appeal to a code of honor shared by officers as one officer to another. Only an officer could talk to a fellow officer in that way. If there'd been an officer in Iran, he could have said, these men were only following my orders. You know, and I know that armies are nothing without discipline. You surely understand that. Let them go to a prisoner of war camp and try me. The other question was there an Irish dimension to these shootings? Yes, there was. It appeared numerically. 10 of the executed soldiers were Irish regiments. It's probably slightly overrepresented, but then we're talking small samples. But was there an Irish dimension here? And yes, there was, a very strong one. And the Irish dimension is the battle for Irish independence, which of course was the dominant issue in British domestic policy in the years before 1914. Irish wanted independence, and here the Germans saw an opportunity they thought they could exploit. And what they did was to try and create an Irish Brigade. They saw that England's threat is Germany's opportunity, but to do this, they had to present themselves as Ireland's friend. So a plan was hatched for the Irish Brigade, and the plan was to send 3,000 Irish POWs and to form them into an Irish Brigade, into a unit which could be armed and sent to Ireland to mount rebellion against the British. This was a failure as the scheme only attracted 50 recruits, but throughout 1915, Irish prisoners of war are consistently given more favourable treatment, better food, better cigarettes, better accommodation. Now it runs counter to this policy if Irish-born soldiers caught on the run are being shot. News of these executions was starting to arrive in Ireland and was reported in the Irish press from March 1915 onwards. Now, the problem for the Germans was that they found it hard to distinguish between Irish-born soldiers in the British Army and those born elsewhere. This was due to what I call the open nature of recruitment to the Edwardian Army. It was a volunteer army, and the would-be recruit could go anywhere. English-born soldiers could go into Irish regiments, Irish-born soldiers could join English regiments. This confused the Germans, and I think it was one of the reasons why they stopped shooting British soldiers. For this, there's the testimony of 3 soldiers. Drummer Kidd, who was from the Inniskillen Fusiliers. He was an Irishman in an Irish regiment, and he was on the run near Saint-Quentin for nearly 3 years. He was taken prisoner in 1917. This is in Etappe number 2. He's taken to Avesnes prison, beaten up, tried and sentenced to death. Later, he learns that his sentence is commuted to 10 years hard labor. When he asks why, he is told, because you're Irish. Cheeseman and Webb were English born, but in an Irish regiment, 4th Royal Irish Dragoon Guards. They too have been on the run for nearly 3 years. They too are in Avesnes prison at the same time as Kidd. By this time, word has spread that being Irish saves lives. During the trial, they tell the tribunal that they're Irish. They are sentenced to death, but then the death sentences are commuted. So we can see some of the problems with Auftrag's tactic here. The pattern of executions with British soldiers caught behind the lines is an excellent case study in how this strategy of Auftrag's tactic compromised wider strategic aims. And there are clear parallels here with the Nurse Cavell case. The execution of Nurse Cavell was taken by a local commander, the military governor of Brussels. Tactically, it was a success. An estimated 4,000 Allied soldiers were flushed out of hiding. But strategically, it was a disaster, giving recruitment to the British Army a much needed boost and lowering domestic resistance to the entry of the USA into the First World War. Similarly here, the execution of British soldiers is considered to have compromised or to have the possibility of compromising British attempts to persuade sufficient numbers of Irish to subvert the British war effort. So this doctrine of Auftragstaktik was good for military campaigns, but it was much less better at the problems of managing civilians, managing rear zone areas, much less suited to that. And it gave rise to pockets of extreme violence. And we can see that in the pattern of executions of the British soldiers. Right, 12th man. There are always rumors around this story that there'd been a 12th British soldier who had escaped at the last minute. And the first reference I can come across this is in the diary of a local man. And he says this on the 24th of February, before the soldiers had been shot. So it isn't something which has come along later on. When I asked Denis Chalandre, who was the son of Clovis Chalandre, were there 11 or 12 men, his reply slightly took me aback. He said, were there 11 or 12 men? That's a good question. You know, my mother always said there were 13. There are early reports, as I said, that there'd been a 12th man. There are a number of soldiers who we can nominate for as possibilities for this. I review them in the book, but the most interesting of these is a soldier called Charlie, known simply as Charlie. From the accounts, French accounts, he appears to have been about 18 years old. Apparently, he looked like a baby. The French were shocked that the British would send anyone so young to fight. He seems to have spent some time in Iran before the raid on the 15th of December. How long, we don't know. He left because he thought it was too dangerous to stay. From there, he went to live rough in the woods, and he's eventually found and taken in by a young woman who has 3 children. Has a farm, and she survives the many confiscatory raids made by the Germans by pretending that Charlie is deaf and dumb. Later in the war, the Germans requisition the farm for billets. The Germans are now a permanent feature of the farm, and he needs to be hidden. The solution was another manure heap. In the farmyard was a clean manure heap of bedding straw. A car bonnet was placed under this, and Charlie hid there. Food and drink would be passed to him by the children under the noses of the Germans. The children would play a version of Ring a Ring a Rosies around the manure heap, and as part of that game, they would put their hands in and pass food and drink to him. The village is liberated by the French First Army on the 4th of November. On 6th of November, a British Army staff car appears. The officers thank the village and the young woman. Charlie embraced the young woman and the children in what one observer describes as a most touching and moving way. Charlie climbs in the staff car alongside the soldiers, and with that he disappears from history. And this might be a good place to finish. This is somewhere where many of you will have been. It's the memorial to the missing on the retreat to the Marne at La Ferté-sous-Jouarre. It's to the 3,743 members of the BEF lost on the retreat to the Marne. They all went missing, but they all die. The Iran Memorial Fund was founded in 2011, and it raised money for memorials to this event. There's one in the centre of the village, which some of you may have seen, which is a bronze plaque, which tells their story. We also found Vincent Chalandre's grave in the cemetery in Guise. It was unmarked when we found it in 2006, and we've put a plaque on that. And we've also marked the execution spot in the chateau with a plaque as well. That is currently unfit for purpose, and we need to replace that as a matter of urgency. So we're still in the market for donations. So if any of you feel like making us a donation, it'd be gratefully received. And you can find out how to do that on the Iran 12 story website. Okay, that's me finished. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Hedley, super. Thanks very much indeed for that. That was tremendous. Thoroughly enjoyed that. So, as Hedley's pointed out, it's Q&A time. But before we do questions, if we'd just like to raise our hands in the usual manner as the virtual round of applause for Hedley's presentation. And I can confirm, Hedley, that there's 400, 500 hands going up here as a virtual round of applause. So thanks very much for that. I've got a question here from Malcolm Pond, who unfortunately has no webcam, so has asked me to ask the question for him. So Malcolm has asked, what happened to Bachelet after the war? Was official action taken against him or unofficial? I think in terms of the French reaction to collaborators after liberation in 1944.
What happened to Bachelet was that when the French liberated Iran in the first week of November 1918, he was taken prisoner and he was taken off to the military prison in Soissons, where he died on Armistice Day 1918. I don't think the end would have been good for him.
Sure, right, thanks for that. Jim Payne, your microphone's open, so off you go with your question, Jim.
Yeah, this was brilliant talk, Hedley. I've been looking forward to it for weeks. I read your original article in Stand 2. I've read McIntyre's book on Villaret, which I know quite a lot more about. And I've been to Guise and Iran, but couldn't get into the chateau, which will happen my next visit. But the couple of questions I've got is, did the British government know anything about these executions at the time? And I know they knew about Cavell, and was anything done about it actually during the war as it went on? And the other bit is you said about the guys saluting at their execution, but also in your article it said their hands were probably tied. Is that?
Let me take the first question first. That's perhaps the easiest one to answer.
Sorry.
Did the British government know about this? Yes, they took a file on this whole affair in the summer of 1917. They knew about it. The way in which it worked was that the evidence was collected by British military intelligence, I don't know from where, and they passed it on to the Foreign Office, where they fell under the auspices of the Prisoner of War Department. And they were responsible for looking after prisoner of war welfare on both sides of the fence, German prisoners here and British prisoners there. Yes, they wanted to do something about it. There was a man there called Van Sittart, who was in charge of the department, and he was a fire eater. And he thought this was an appalling act. He called it a typical act of German brutality. He fed the story to the press, and it came out in the Daily Express, I think early in 1918, under the headline of "Murdered by Huns." So yes, they knew about it, but the capacity for retaliation was limited. There were always tensions, and you can see these in the files as you go through it, between the War Office and the Foreign Office about how to respond to this, and one or two other atrocities they took as well. You can always, there's also the file for Corporal Hull there. But the ability was muted by the fact that whatever you did to German prisoners, the Germans had much more capacity to do it to British prisoners, simply because the fact that they held more of them. So what Van Sittart wanted to do when he heard about this incident, is he suggested taking out 11 German prisoners of war and shooting them. And the War Office wouldn't wear that. Later on, in 1918, when he takes some more information on German atrocities, mainly against prisoners of war, he has a novel suggestion. He thinks they should take German officers and move them across to the Western fronts to work in a Labour battalion. Not any old Labour battalion, a native Labour battalion. And this, I think, was precisely designed to appeal to German racial sensibilities. And again, the army wouldn't wear that for him. After the war, it's difficult, because after 1919, 1920, and the formation of the Weimar Republic, the fate of British soldiers during the war wasn't really a problem, wasn't the problem. The problem was shoring up the Weimar Republic and in trying not to do anything which would precipitate a right-wing military coup there. And this was one of the reasons why they went in. They didn't really push this very, very hard at all. And the number of German officers after the war was quite derisory. I think there were only 6. I hope that answers the first question. Yeah, I mean, on the second one, there are contradictions about what happened there. Whether those soldiers were hands were tied, clearly they couldn't dig the ditch with tied hands. Clearly they couldn't salute with tied hands. So that is a contradiction. And I just don't know what the answer to it is.
Brilliant.
Thanks for your question there, Jim. Thanks for your answer. Richard Owen, Richard, your mic's live. You want to ask away?
Hedley, thank you very much for a great lecture. I was just wondering, as someone who's interested in sort of occupation, especially in France, how the Loger, Griselin and Chalande family confronted each other in peacetime.
That's again a very good question. The Chalande, I didn't mention this in the talk, it's in the book, but the Chalande family, one of the difficulties in gathering information about this through the family is the Chalande family were badly split. Clovis was radical, left-wing socialist, and he was an atheist. His sister, Germaine, she was a right-wing Christian Scientist. And the tensions between the two were that Clovis went to Paris and Germaine went back to Iran. And there were many, many tensions there in the family. They very, very rarely met. In fact, one of the signs of the tensions was in the Guise communal cemetery, where the father is buried there and there's no marker on the grave, none at all. It wasn't in 2006 when we found it. Yet she is a wealthy woman she's only living 4 miles away. Were there tensions between so you don't have the free flow of information, the family gossip, and one member stimulating another, which might have got this going. The Loge family and the Chalandre family, were there tensions between them? I think possibly there were. The bête noire in this story, until I wrote the book, was Clovis Chalandre. Everything was going to be all right as long as Clovis kept his mouth shut and kept to the story. He couldn't do that. And that was a heavy burden to lay on the shoulders of a 16-year-old. The Chalandres, Clovis Chalandre, moved to Paris, and he never went back to Iran after 1919, 1920. He never talked about the story. He didn't talk about it to his sons, and he didn't talk much about it to his wives. And he was a very melancholic man. His sons, who are now both successful businessmen, remember him as being very sad, very depressed, would never talk about the story. Every time he tried to do so, he broke down in tears. He died on Armistice Day in 1948, and he dies of cirrhosis of the liver. And according to his sons, he drank himself to death, and he drank to forget, because he was laden with a large part of the responsibility for this story.
Thank you. I mean, you see what goes on in places like Jersey, and I often wondered what would have happened in the UK had we been invaded by the Nazis, you know, with, the confrontation in villages, you know, deception.
Yes, yeah.
Thanks for your question there, Richard. Sarah Helen Snow. Sarah, do you want to just unmute yourself there?
Hi. Yes, thank you for a very informative talk. What happened to the little kids that were left there while their, families got dragged away to prison and so?
This is the most tragic part of the story. There were 3 small children, Leonie, Martha, and Marcel. The eldest was about 10, the youngest was 6. When their house was burnt down, they were turned out onto the streets. The German number 2, a man called Wolf, asked the crowd who were assembled if anybody would take them in. Nobody did. They were left to wander around the streets of Iran, fighting for what food they could. Later on in 1915, the town council raises a loan of 300 francs, and it offers this to any family who will take them in. No one came forward. Eventually, they were picked up by the Germans in 1917, after 2 years living in the streets, and they're taken to a farm in Flanders, where a farmer agrees to look after them. While this is going on, Olympe is in prison in Germany, where she has contracted TB meningitis. You may have seen the photograph of her, which I showed earlier on. She looks like an old woman. She was 43 when that photo was taken. She comes back with her eldest daughter, Germaine. They go to Iran, and they're reunited with the 3 children. Unfortunately, she passes on the TB meningitis to her 3 children, and none of them reaches more than about 22, 23. They all die of TB meningitis, as does the mother. You may ask why the people in Iran didn't do anything about it, and the answer I received to that one, I asked about it, was that they were all terrified. The man who witnessed the execution and witnessed the soldiers burying them was a native of Iran, and he was there to make sure that the story went back. And I think they were terrified. They thought that this was a ruse by which the Germans could flush out any French sympathizers, anyone who was who was against the Germans, and that anyone who took them in would be arrested and suffer the same fate as the soldiers. But it's the worst part of this story. That's what happened to them. So it doesn't just kill the 12 soldiers and the one civilian in Iran, it kills 3 children and it kills 1 adult, Olam Shalom.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. David Muir, David, your question is identical to Anthony's, Chris and Gordon's. So on behalf of quite a few people, fire away with your question there.
Yes, I'd just like to ask what happened to Vechta after the war, because there were parallels in World War II where usually SS detachments had committed atrocities similar to this, maybe more extreme in that there wasn't even a show trial, but and they were classified as war criminals. But
yeah,
did he go into some of the Stahlhelm brigades?
What happened to him was his background is he was an artillery officer. At the time of the executions, his artillery unit was over on the Eastern Front. And I assume he was combed out of there and given this particular job. He was very good at his job, that's clear. The Germans liked him, and what happened to him is that in the summer of 1915, he was transferred out of Guise and he was moved across to Belgrade. Now, given the importance of the Balkans in the First World War and some of the people there, this is not a job you would have given to an idiot. So I assume that in spite of or because of what he did to the soldiers in Iran, he was very highly regarded in the German army. Now, what happened to him is that the French came looking for him in 1919. They wanted to put him on trial for the execution of a French soldier who'd fallen into his clutches. This is a soldier called Robert Tierno, whom he'd executed in December 1914. Tierno was a refugee. He was left behind from the 28th Regiment. He was a Norman. He was a lawyer's clerk, and his mistake was that he kept a journal in the shorthand of his trade. And this convinced Vechta, who he was a spy, and he shot them. So when the settling of accounts came up, the French tried to find him and they tried to get him extradited. But the charges against him or French interest in military cases was dropped. There was, as far as I remember, just the most appalling horse trading went on between the British and the French as to who should be brought to trial. The British always had a vested interest, being a naval power, in making sure the admirals and the architects of submarine warfare were brought to trial. The French had very little interest in this, but they were interested in people who'd committed war crimes against their citizens. And there was what I can only describe as the most appalling pieces of horse trading went on between the two. And eventually, the British agreed to drop charges against the sailors if the French agreed to drop charges against the military men. And that's what happened. He walked free. He walked free. We don't hear of him again. It's hard to trace. But the information I have is that he died as a civilian in 1944. The only Germans who were brought to book for any atrocities in this part of the world was a prison camp commander at Flavie-le-Martel, a man called Müller. Flavie-le-Martel was probably the worst run prisoner of war camp on the Western Front. Appalling 1,200 British soldiers died there as a result of dysentery, unhygienic conditions. The prison camp commander he was the highest ranking officer who was tried. You know, and if you're not going to go for the big fish like Hindenburg, like von Falkenhayn, you may as well forget it. There's no point in going after these people like Müller, who at the end of the day only got a 6-month sentence. So he went to Belgrade, must have been a promotion, not a job he'd give to an idiot. We lose trace of him after that. The French want him, the French don't get him, and he disappears out of history.
Thanks for that, Hedley. Thanks for your question, David. John Richardson. John, did you just want to mute yourself there?
I'm really interested in the history of the Central India Horse, and I've just read a book about Major Tom Westmacott, and in the book is called Major Tom's War, and chapter 13 describes the surrender of 27 soldiers who were up in the forest just north of the area you're talking, and they lived in the forest, and it was decided they had to surrender, but they were really worried they were going to be shot. So the villagers of Bavet, or the town of Bavet, they laundered all those soldiers' clothes. The soldiers marched into town by arrangement. They stacked their arms in the middle of the village square. They went into the church until some Germans arrived. Then they marched in good order into the town square, stood to attention to surrender. The mayor was had a gun at his head, and everything was going to be not very pretty. All the villagers were around, and the priest prayed on the memorial in the village, and then suddenly it was going to be all right, and the 27 soldiers got on lorries, a lorry, their weapons were put on another lorry, and they went away. Is that something that came into your studies?
It sounds like the Bushell-Preston party, who were a team of about...
Bushell was the man, the lieutenant.
Bushell was the man.
But he
Claude
didn't...
Bushell,
But Bushell didn't go in with the 27 soldiers. He was taken off separately, wasn't he?
No, he and Preston escaped back to England. They let the soldiers go. They made their way back to England. This sounds like the Bushell-Preston party. Yes, I found a file of papers on them, including a diary of a soldier who was with this group in the Belgian National Archives in the Princess Marie de Croix papers. Princess Marie de Croix was the person who was looking after them. Yes, I do know about that story, and I've written about it in the book. It's in chapter 2, Occupation. And I also make the point about the highly restricted nature of German executions. Now, Bavet and Maubeuge, politically, they're in France, but the Germans regarded them as in Belgium, and they were therefore subject to German military law. And because of that, they weren't in any danger of being shot, despite what the Germans may have been menaced, because the Germans had a policy that in Belgium, they did not shoot British soldiers on the run. So yes, I know the story. It's an interesting story because it's one of the few occasions when British soldiers on the run decide to take matters in their own hands and to launch a strike against the Germans. And it wasn't very successful, but I'm sometimes asked, did any British soldiers actually go in for behind the lines operations? And this is one of the few examples where they did. It's a very good story, and you can find a full account of it in chapter 2 of my book.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, John, for that.
Thank
Kevin.
you.
Oh, right. Well, thank you, Hedley. That was a fascinating and very interesting presentation. On the human side, I think when you were talking about an emotion in your voice, and I'm very interested in what stimulated you to investigate it, how you got into this story at the very beginning.
Well, When I first got an interest in the First World War in 1990, I was also interested in genealogy. My grandfather was Irish, and he was sometime a Royal Munster Fusilier. And I joined the Royal Munster Fusiliers Association, and I got their regimental magazine. And this story appeared as 2 pages in the regimental magazine. And here the Munsters deserve a lot of credit because they kept this story alive. Every 20, 30 years or so, they would reprint and republish it. At that time, I read this and a number of questions just went through my head. It was only two pages. I said, well, you know, this is about what the French called liaisons anglais, but there were 12 of them and one of them was French. You know, so this is a mistitle. I was interested in the story, but then at that time I couldn't do anything about it. I was living and working in Northern England. 7 years later, purely by happenstance, I found myself working in Lille. And Lille's about 120 kilometers from Iran. And when I bought a car, I said to Mrs. Malloch, come on, we'll go down to Iran for a day and we'll see what happens. And we went down to Iran, and just purely by happenstance, I ran into the mayor, who was the great grandson of Leonid Loges, and he took me in and we had a talk as much as his English and my French would allow. Professionally, it interested me in another way because I taught strategic management and strategy development and business ethics in business schools in France. And the case interested me because it goes to the heart of some very important strategic management questions. It doesn't matter what the organization is. Now, why do organizations say one thing, but then do another? The Germans shouldn't have done any of this. They had apparently willingly signed up to the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Conventions. But in actions like this, and in thousands of others up and down the Western Front, they hadn't taken any notice of it at all. So that interested me professionally. Could I explain this? And to some extent, I wrote the book as a case study in business ethics. Why is it that organizations behave unethically? And you have to explain that. You have to explain it. Otherwise, you demonize the Germans. And whatever else they were not demons. Though occasionally, some of them behaved in a demonic way. And when I went into the literature, I didn't find any explanation for this. The French histories of the occupation don't explain it at all. They're very good at cataloguing, they're very good at describing, and they're very good at evaluating the effects. But there's no explanation for why the Germans did this. If you look at some of the English language books, particularly Horn and Kramer, the only explanation you get is it was a response to the fear of francs-tireurs, the civilian sharpshooters, the semi-official bands which wandered around behind the lines and which didn't conduct war in a Clausewitzian manner. And I didn't find that very satisfactory. There's a historian, an American historian called Isabel Hull, who's written 2 fantastic books on this. Absolute Destruction is one, A Piece of Paper is another. And she starts to explain them in terms of words, language that I would understand. And she starts to talk about the culture of the German army. And I think that in the book, I try and just take that a bit further. And you can explain what happened in terms of what their rule book said, what their training said, the total lack of political accountability of the German army to the political structure, because what the occupation needed was some civilian oversight. This was far too important, as Nurse Cavell showed, just to be left to soldiers. And all of that was lacking. The francs-tireurs were part of this, but only a small part. So I was interested professionally. I was also engaged in it because there were 5 Munster Fusiliers in that, and that was my grandfather's regiment.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for that full answer there, Hedley. Thanks for your question there, Kevin. Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be it for tonight, I'm afraid. I'd like to thank Hedley once more for his excellent presentation. I'm just going to go into screen share right now just to show the website of the Iron 12, which hopefully is there on. Are we in screen share correctly there? Yeah, I think we are. So just if anybody wishes to check up on the Iron 12, please do so. Ladies and gentlemen, that's it for tonight. Once again, a round of applause silently and virtually for Hedley for that excellent presentation. I've certainly enjoyed that. I've heard the talk before when you came to the branch, Hedley, and it was certainly worth hearing again in a slightly truncated manner. So thank you for keeping to time. And ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't done so already, please do register for the next webinar on Thursday and indeed the one next week. And on that note, Hedley, sincere thanks for your presentation. We did suffer from a little bit of
thank you too.
It's quite all right. We suffered from a little bit of buffering during it. I don't think it stopped the enjoyment of it, but it was a super evening. So thanks very much. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen,
thank you very much, David.
No worries. And on that note,
stay safe.
Stay safe, indeed. Thanks very much. See you next time.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières.